The vast Montana sky was a canvas of merciless blue, stretching from one end of the Sinclair ranch to the other without a single cloud to offer respite. Down below, the land itself seemed to hold its breath under the oppressive August heat. It was a land of sweeping plains and distant, tooth-like mountains. A kingdom built by the late Mr. Sinclair and now ruled with an iron fist by his widow, Mabel. And on this land Ira worked. Ira was a man built on the same scale as the territory. Tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and hands calloused from a lifetime of labor. When he swung an axe or hoisted a hay bale, it was with an economy of motion that spoke of raw, natural strength. But this physical power was a fortress built around a timid soul. His eyes, a startlingly gentle blue, rarely met another's gaze, preferring the company of the dirt at his feet. His voice, when he could be coaxed to use it, was a low rumble, often stumbling over words as if they were stones in his path. From the shaded veranda of the grand ranch house, Mabel Sinclair watched him. She sat perfectly still in a wicker chair, a glass of lemonade sweating onto the polished wood table beside her. Dressed in a crisp, high-collared white blouse and a dark riding skirt, she looked less like a woman enduring the heat and more like a queen surveying her domain. Her green eyes, sharp and calculating, followed Ira as he mended a fence line near the stable. He was, she often thought, the finest asset her late husband had ever acquired. He had come with the land, a teenage orphan taken in for work, and had grown into the most efficient, tireless worker she had ever seen. Loyal, silent, and most importantly, hers. She didn't think of it as employment. She provided him with a roof, food, and purpose. In return, he gave her his strength, his obedience, his very presence. It was a balanced transaction in her mind. She owned the land, the cattle, the house, and in a way that defied legal definition but was an unshakable truth in her heart, she owned Ira. He was a part of the Sinclair legacy, as permanent and essential as the river that cut through the valley. The idea that he might have thoughts or desires of his own was a foolish notion she never entertained. His shyness, which others saw as a weakness, she saw as a guarantee. He was too afraid of the world to ever leave the one she had constructed around him. A perfect, gilded cage. Tonight she planned to reinforce the bars. As dusk bled purple and orange across the horizon, the ranch house came alive with light and laughter. Mabel was hosting a dinner for the most influential landowners in the county. It was a display of power, a reminder to all that the Sinclair ranch had not faltered with its master's passing. Ira was instructed to make himself presentable and remain on hand. He hated these affairs. The press of bodies, the loud talk, the endless questions he couldn't answer without his face burning red and his tongue tying itself in knots. He stood near the doorway of the great room, feeling as out of place as a draft horse in a ballroom. His clean but worn work clothes a stark contrast to the tailored suits and silken dresses of the guests. He tried to make himself small, to melt into the shadows, but Mabel would not allow it. "Ira, come here," she called, her voice slicing through the din. It was not a request. He shuffled forward, his gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. He could feel every eye in the room turned to him, dissecting him, judging him. Mabel placed a proprietary hand on his forearm. Her touch was light, but it felt like a brand. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Gable," she said, addressing the small circle of her most powerful neighbors. "You all know my IRA. There isn't a harder worker in all of Montana." The men nodded, their eyes appraising him like livestock. "A good man is hard to find, Mabel," one of them said, puffing on a cigar. "Especially one so steadfast." "Precisely," Mabel said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "A ranch is only as strong as its foundation, and as I look to the future, to ensuring the Sinclair name continues to thrive, I know the importance of securing that foundation." She squeezed Ira's arm, her painted nails digging slightly into his flesh. "A permanent arrangement is in order, one that will bind the strongest elements of this ranch together, for good." The meaning was as clear as the crystal glasses on the table. A murmur of understanding went through the group. They looked from the powerful widow to the towering, silent man beside her, and they saw not a marriage proposal, but a business merger, an acquisition. Mabel was announcing that she was formalizing her ownership. For IRA, the words struck like a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs. Asterisk, permanent arrangement. Bind together. For good. Asterisk, the room began to spin. The polite conversation faded into a deafening roar in his ears. He wasn't a man to her. He was a foundation. A pillar. A thing to be legally tethered to her property so it could never, ever leave. The cage door wasn't just being locked. It was being welded shut. He saw his entire future spooling out before him. An endless succession of days just like this one, silent and serviceable, until he was too old and broken to be of use. A ghost haunting his own life. He managed a jerky nod, pulled his arm from her grasp, and mumbled something about checking on the horses before turning and fleeing the room. He didn't stop until he was in the cool, familiar dark of the barn. the smell of hay and leather a balm to his frayed nerves. He leaned against a stall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Panic, cold and sharp, gave way to a desperate, terrifying resolve. He couldn't stay. He would rather die of starvation in the wilderness than live as Mabel Sinclair's husband and name her prized possession. He had to run. Tonight. He waited for hours. A coiled spring of anxiety in the hayloft, watching as the lights in the main house went out one by one. A sliver of moon offered little illumination, cloaking the world in deep shadows. The silence of the night was a heavy blanket, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of his own heart. When he was certain the entire household was asleep, he crept down from the loft. His plan was simple, born of desperation rather than cunning. He had a small bundle of belongings he'd stashed a week prior. A spare shirt, a small sack of dried jerky, a water skin for a day he hadn't truly believed would come. He would head north toward the mountains. He could lose himself there, find work at a logging camp, or maybe just keep moving until the name Sinclair was a distant echo. He slipped out of the barn, moving with a stealth he didn't know he possessed. He avoided the main path, sticking to the edge of the fields where the shadows were deepest. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of a distant owl sent a jolt of fear through him. He imagined the ranch hands being roused, the dogs set loose, the chase. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. He needed to put distance between himself and the ranch before sunrise. He broke into a clumsy, stumbling run, his eyes struggling to adjust to the oppressive darkness. He was running on pure adrenaline, his mind a whirlwind of fear and a fragile, flickering hope. He wasn't watching the ground. He was running from the ghost of his future. It was a gnarled tree root, thick as a man's arm and hidden by the tall grass, that brought his escape to its abrupt and agonizing end. His boot caught, his momentum carrying him forward with violent force. He didn't just fall, he was hurled through the air. He landed awkwardly at the bottom of a short, rocky embankment, a gut-wrenching, audible asterisk crack asterisk echoing in the silent night. Searing, white-hot pain shot up from his left ankle. It was a fire that consumed his entire leg, stealing his breath and blurring his vision. He tried to push himself up, but a fresh wave of agony slammed him back to the earth. He gritted his teeth, tears of pain and frustration welling in his eyes as he looked at his foot, now bent at a sickening, unnatural angle. He was done. His one desperate bid for freedom, his frantic flight from a life in chains, had ended less than a mile from where it began. He had tripped over his own feet. He lay there, broken and defeated, the vast, indifferent sky offering no comfort. The silence returned, deeper now, and Ira knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that morning would come, and Mabel Sinclair's men would find her property right where it had fallen. The night was an eternity of pain. Ira drifted in and out of consciousness, each waking moment a fresh wave of agony from his shattered ankle. The cold of the earth seeped into his bones, and the sliver of moon offered no warmth, only a pale, ghostly light that illuminated his failure. He was trapped. The hope that had propelled him into the darkness had evaporated, leaving only the bitter residue of despair. He had tried to break his chains, and in return the world had simply broken him. When the first gray fingers of dawn began to probe the eastern sky, he was convinced they heralded the arrival of Chester, the ranch foreman, and his men. He closed his eyes, waiting for the rough hands and the humiliating journey back to his cage. But the sounds that reached him were not the thunder of hooves or the harsh calls of men. It was something softer. The quiet snap of a twig, a low murmur in a language that flowed like water over stones. He forced his eyes open, his body tensing for a fight he could not win. Two figures stood at the top of the small embankment, silhouetted against the rising sun. They were not ranch hands. The man was old, his long, braided hair as white as winter snow. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his posture was straight and dignified, and his dark eyes held a calm, assessing wisdom. Beside him stood a young woman, perhaps 20 years of age. She carried a hunting bow with an easy grace, her movements fluid and silent. Her own long, dark hair was held back by a simple leather band, and her gaze was direct and serious as she took in his pathetic state. They were Cheyenne, from the tribe whose lands bordered the far northern edge of the Sinclair property. Ira had seen them from a distance but had never spoken to one. Mabel referred to them with a dismissive wave of her hand as if they were little more than features of the landscape. The old man, Watkins, spoke first, his voice a low, steady rumble that held no threat. "You have met with misfortune." It was a statement, not a question. Ira could only manage a pained nod, his throat tight with a mixture of fear and shame. The young woman, Oneida, slid down the embankment with the sure-footedness of a mountain cat. She knelt beside him, her presence radiating a quiet confidence that was the complete opposite of his own crippling shyness. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, didn't linger on his face but went straight to his mangled ankle. She examined it with a practiced touch, her fingers probing gently but firmly. Ira flinched, a hiss of pain escaping his lips. "The bone is broken," she said, looking up at her grandfather. Her voice was as calm and clear as a mountain spring. Ira expected them to leave him. He was a white man, a trespasser on their hunting grounds, and he was useless baggage. Instead, Walken made his way down the slope and looked at Ira, not with pity, but with a simple, human acknowledgement of his suffering. "We cannot leave you for the vultures or the wolves," Walken said, "or for the woman who owns the land. Sometimes they are the same, with a skill born of long practice." They fashioned a makeshift splint from sturdy branches and strips of leather from Oneida's pack. Then, using a thick blanket, they created a travois. The process was agonizing for Ira, every movement sending jolts of fire up his leg, but he bore it in silence. He was stunned by their selfless kindness. No one had ever shown him such care. On the Sinclair ranch, an injured animal was treated with more concern because it had monetary value. He, as a man, was simply expected not to break. They pulled him back to their camp, a small hidden settlement in a grove of cottonwood trees by a creek. It wasn't a large village, just a handful of teepees and hide-covered shelters. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and pine. As they entered, a few people emerged to look, their faces curious but not hostile. Walken spoke to them in their own tongue, and the curiosity softened into something like acceptance. Oneida led them to her family's teepee. Inside, she set to work on his ankle with an array of pouches and tools. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle, and then applied a poultice of crushed leaves that smelled earthy and cool. The throbbing in his ankle began to subside, replaced by a dull, manageable ache. As she worked, he found himself watching her hands. They were strong, capable hands, yet they moved with an unhurried grace that he found mesmerizing. Walken sat across from him, tending to a small fire. "The woman from the great house will be looking for you," he said, his eyes on the flames. "She does not like to lose what is hers." The words struck a chord deep inside Ira. Asterisk, what is hers? Asterisk, that was exactly how he felt. A possession. He looked at the old man, and for the first time since the night before, he felt the urge to speak, to explain. The words usually got stuck in his throat, a logjam of fear and self-doubt. But here, in the quiet warmth of this teepee, away from the judging eyes and the crushing weight of expectation, something felt different. I had to leave," he said. The words came out quietly, but they were clear. There was no stutter. Walken nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. "A man's spirit is not meant for a cage, even if the bars are made of gold." Oneida finished wrapping his ankle in clean strips of linen. She met his gaze, and her dark eyes held a flicker of understanding. "You are safe here," she said. "Rest. Heal." And for the first time in his adult life, Ira felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He was a fugitive, injured, and with no future. Yet in this humble shelter, surrounded by strangers, he felt more like a man than he ever had in the grand Sinclair ranch house. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back at that very house, peace was the furthest thing from Mabel Sinclair's mind. She stood on the veranda, her back ramrod straight, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hand. Her face was a mask of cold fury. The day had begun with the discovery of his empty bed. At first she'd felt a flicker of annoyance, assuming he was merely up early for his chores. But when Chester reported that Ira's few personal belongings were gone from his small room in the bunkhouse, the annoyance had curdled into a cold, venomous rage. He had run. Her IRA, her silent, dependable, asterisk, controllable, asterisk IRA had found the audacity to defy her. It wasn't just an act of disobedience. It was a personal betrayal, a slap in the face. She had given him everything, a home, security, her patronage. She was going to give him her name, the ultimate protection. And he had thrown it all back at her, disappearing into the night like a common thief. "Find him," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Chester stood before her, hat in his hands, his face grim. He was a man fiercely loyal to the Sinclair name and, by extension, to her. "Ma'am, we've checked the property lines. No sign. It's like he vanished," Chester reported. "Men do not vanish, Chester," she snapped, her green eyes glittering like chips of ice. "He is on foot, and he is a fool. He knows nothing of the world beyond these fences. He will be lost, hungry, and desperate. I want every man available out searching. Check the rivers, the foothills. Send a rider to town and ask the sheriff to keep an eye out for him. I want him found. I want him brought back." "Yes, ma'am," Chester said, turning to leave. "And Chester," she added, her voice dropping even lower, "when you find him, be sure he understands the depth of his ingratitude. He is my property. And he will learn that you do not run from me." The message was clear. This was not a rescue mission. It was a retrieval, a reclamation. Within the hour, a dozen riders fanned out from the Sinclair ranch, their faces set and determined. They were hunters now, and their quarry was a shy, blue-eyed man who had dared to believe he could be free. The search had begun, relentless and unforgiving, a tightening net that would inevitably find its way toward a quiet camp by a cottonwood creek. The days that followed were a strange and peaceful dream for Ira. Life in Wakon's camp was governed by the rhythm of the sun and the needs of the community, not the demanding clang of the ranch bell. Under Onita's care, the fire in his ankles slowly subsided into a dull, healing ache. She taught him which roots to chew to ease the pain and how to rewrap the splint to keep the bone set properly. He would watch her for hours as she worked, tanning hides with a focused intensity or weaving intricate patterns into a basket, her hands moving with a purpose and skill that fascinated him. In this place of quiet dignity, the knots in Ira's own tongue began to unravel. He spoke with Wakon about the stars, learning the Cheyenne names for the constellations that he had only ever seen as nameless points of light. He talked with Oneida about the horses they kept, discovering they shared a deep, unspoken understanding of the animals. He told her stories of his childhood, fragments of a life he'd never shared with anyone, and she listened with a serene attention that made him feel seen for the first time. He learned to laugh, a rusty, unfamiliar sound that started deep in his chest. The timid shell he had lived in for so long was beginning to crack, revealing the man who had been hiding inside. He was still quiet, but it was a chosen quiet now, not one imposed by fear. He was sitting by the creek, carefully putting weight on his healing ankle as Oneida had instructed, when the dream was shattered. It began as a low rumble on the edge of hearing, a distant vibration felt more than heard. It grew steadily, resolving into the unmistakable sound of a large group of horses approaching at a determined pace. Panic, a cold and familiar serpent coiled in his stomach. He knew with absolute certainty who was coming. Oneida, who had been gathering herbs nearby, straightened up, her body instantly alert. Her eyes met Ira's, and in them he saw not fear but a calm resolve. Wakon emerged from his teepee, his wise old face unreadable. Within moments the camp was silent and still, the people melting back to stand as silent witnesses. They didn't have to wait long. A dozen riders crested the small hill overlooking the camp, their horses churning up dust. At their lead was Chester, his face set in a grim, triumphant scowl. They reined in at the edge of the clearing, a formidable line of armed men, their presence an act of open aggression in this peaceful grove. They were a stark intrusion of iron and leather into a world of wood and hide. Chester's eyes scanned the camp and landed on Ira. A sneer twisted his lips. "Well, look what we have here," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Lost your way, boy." He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling with menace. Mrs. Sinclair was worried. Time to come home. He strode toward Ira, clearly expecting him to cower and obey as he always had. He reached out to grab Ira's arm, to haul him up like a sack of grain. No. The word was quiet, but it was as solid as a granite boulder. Stopped Chester in his tracks. He stared, dumbfounded, as Ira used a sturdy branch to push himself to his feet. He swayed, his injured ankle screaming in protest, but he stood. Oneida moved to his side, a silent offer of support, and he gratefully steadied himself with a hand on her shoulder. He looked directly at Chester, his blue eyes clear and unwavering. "I said no," Ira repeated, his voice stronger this time. "I am not your boy, Chester, and I won't be dragged back." Chester was so shocked he could only gape for a moment before his face flushed with anger. "What did you say to me? You'll do as you're told. You belong to the Sinclair ranch." "I work at the ranch," Ira corrected him, his voice gaining confidence with every word he spoke, words he never knew he had. "That does not mean it owns me. My ankle is broken. When I can walk properly, I will return. As a man, not as a stray dog you've cornered." The other riders shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, murmuring amongst themselves. They had never heard Ira speak more than 2 words in a row, let alone defy an order. Wakon stepped forward, his presence alone a formidable barrier. "The man is a guest in our camp," the old chief said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "He is injured. He is under our protection. He will leave when he is ready, and not before." Chester's hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip. "This ain't your concern, old man. This is ranch business." The tension snapped taut, the air vibrating with the promise of violence. The Cheyenne warriors, who had seemed to appear from nowhere, held bows with arrows nocked, their faces impassive but their intent clear. It was at that moment that a new rider appeared, parting the line of ranch hands like a ship through water. It was Mabel Sinclair. She sat atop her pristine black mare, dressed in a perfectly tailored riding habit, looking as though she were presiding over a garden party. Not a speck of dust marred her clothes, not a hair was out of place. Her control was absolute. She ignored everyone else, her piercing green eyes locking onto Ira. A furious storm raged behind their calm facade. "Ira," she said, her voice dangerously soft, "this foolishness ends now. You will come with us." He felt a tremor of his old fear, the ingrained instinct to obey her. Her voice was the sound of his cage, the key turning in the lock. He looked at her, the woman who had defined his entire existence. Then he glanced at Oneida, whose quiet strength was a pillar beside him. He looked at Wakon, whose simple respect had given him the courage to stand. He took a breath, drawing in the free air of this place, and found his resolve. "No, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I will not." For the first time in her life, Mabel Sinclair was visibly stunned, but the shock was quickly followed by something else as she truly took in the scene before her. She saw Ira, her timid, broken workhorse, standing straighter than she had ever seen him. His shoulders were back, his chin was up, and he was leaning on a young, beautiful native girl, their proximity an unspoken statement of alliance. He was not just defying her, he was choosing them over her. A toxic mix of jealousy and rage burned in her chest. How dare he? How dare they? They had taken her possession and somehow fixed him. They had given him a spine. And in that moment of pure possessive fury, a strange, unwelcome thought pierced through her anger. She had never seen him look so much like a man, not the useful tool she managed, but a whole person, filled with a fire she never knew he had. It was a fleeting, grudging spark of admiration, and it infuriated her even more. She could order her men to take him. There would be a fight. Blood would be shed. It would be messy, ugly, and beneath her. She ruled through control, not brute force. A different, more calculated strategy formed in her mind. She dismounted, her boots making a soft sound on the earth. She walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. The air crackled between them. "Very well," she said, the words clipped and precise, shocking everyone, most of all Chester. "You wish to return on your own 2 feet like a man? Then do so." She looked at his splinted ankle with disdain. "You have 1 week. When you can walk, you will ride back to the ranch. You will come to the main house. We will discuss the terms of your future then." She turned without waiting for a reply, her back rigid. "We are leaving," she announced to her stunned men. With an immaculate turn, she mounted her horse. She gave Ira one last long look, her eyes promising a reckoning. Then she spurred the mare and rode away, her men scrambling to follow, leaving a cloud of dust and a stunned silence in their wake. Ira stood, his heart pounding, leaning on Oneida as the adrenaline drained away, leaving him trembling. He had faced the queen in her own court and had not backed down. The confrontation was over, but he knew, with a chilling certainty, the war for his own soul had just begun. The week passed in a blur of determined healing. Ira tested his ankle every day, pushing it a little further, his resolve hardening with each step he took without stumbling. The physical pain was a distant echo compared to the strength he found in his own spirit. He was no longer the man who had fled in the night. That man was a ghost, left behind in the dust of the Sinclair ranch. The morning of his departure was quiet and solemn. Wakan placed a hand on his shoulder, his dark eyes filled with a pride that felt more paternal than anything Ira had ever known. "The strength was always in you, son," the old man said. "You only needed to learn how to stand." His goodbye with Oneida was harder. Words felt inadequate for the gratitude that filled his heart. She had done more than mend his bone. She had helped mend his soul. She simply pressed a small, smooth river stone into his palm. It was cool and solid, a tangible piece of the peace he had found. "Do not forget the feel of the earth beneath your feet," she said softly. "It does not belong to anyone. We only belong to it." He nodded, his throat thick with emotion, and mounted the horse they had provided for him. As he rode away, he didn't look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the sprawling domain of Mabel Sinclair, which no longer looked like a cage, but like a challenge. The ranch hands stopped their work to watch as he rode in, not with the slouch of a recaptured runaway, but with the straight-backed posture of a man returning on his own terms. He ignored their stares, dismounted in front of the main house, and tied the reins. He didn't hesitate. He walked up the steps of the veranda and knocked firmly on the great oak door. Mabel received him in the study, a room designed to intimidate. Dark, heavy furniture, shelves lined with leather-bound books her late husband had never read, and the glassy-eyed heads of hunted animals on the walls. She was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, a queen upon her throne, a ledger open before her as if he were just a minor interruption in her accounting. "You are punctual," she said, her voice cold and level. She did not ask him to sit. "I trust your vacation was restorative." Ira walked to the center of the room and stood before her desk. He was not intimidated by the dead animals or the imposing furniture. He simply saw a woman hiding behind a very large piece of wood. "It was," he said, his voice calm and even. "It gave me time to think." "And what conclusions has all this thinking produced?" she asked, a sarcastic edge to her tone. "I have new terms," he stated simply. Mabel's pen stopped scratching. She slowly looked up, her green eyes narrowing. "You are in no position to be making demands, Ira. You are in a position to beg for your job." "I'm not asking for a job," he replied, his gaze steady. "I'm offering to stay. I will run this ranch with you as your foreman and partner. I'll take a proper wage, and I want the small cabin down by the creek for my own. I'll be treated with respect by you and by the men. We will build this place together, as equals." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the oppressive silence of the room. If you can't agree to that, then I will leave right now. And this time I won't be tripping in the dark. It was a declaration of independence, spoken in the heart of her power. He watched as a storm of emotions crossed her face. Disbelief, fury, outrage. She opened her mouth to unleash the torrent, to cut him down with the sharp words she wielded like weapons, to remind him of his place. But then she looked into his eyes, his calm, clear blue eyes, and she saw no fear, none at all. And the storm broke. Her carefully constructed mask of iron and ice didn't just crack, it shattered. Her shoulders slumped. The anger in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a raw, shocking vulnerability. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away as if ashamed. "You would just leave?" she whispered, the words barely audible. Her voice held not the fury of a queen, but the desolate fear of a woman utterly alone. "Everyone leaves. My parents, they died. My husband, he built this empire, but he never saw me. He saw another asset. And when he died, he left me with all of this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room, which now seemed like a prison. This big, empty, silent house. Her gaze fell upon him, and it was stripped of all pretense. "You were the only thing that was constant, the only thing that was good. You were always here, quiet, strong, IDIDN, single quotes, T. Her voice broke. "I don't know how to ask people to stay. I only know how to hold on. I thought if I owned everything, if I controlled everything, I couldn't be abandoned again." In that moment, Ira's last vestiges of anger dissolved into a profound and aching compassion. He saw past the tyrant to the terrified woman beneath. He realized they had both been prisoners in the same house. He in a cage of timidity, she in a cage of fear. Wakan's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, a spirit is not meant for a cage. Asterisk, he slowly walked around the desk that had been a barrier between them for so long. He stood beside her chair and, after a moment's hesitation, gently placed his large, calloused hand over hers where it rested on the ledger. It was the first time he had ever touched her with anything but fearful obedience. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "I'm not leaving, Mabel," he said, his voice softer now, imbued with an understanding she had never known. "We can do this, together, but not as owner and property, as partners." She looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and for the first time she truly saw him. Not as an asset, not as a foundation, but as Ira, a man, her equal. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The sun was setting, painting the vast Montana sky in hues of rose and gold as they walked the property later that evening. A comfortable silence settled between them, no longer a chasm of fear, but a space of quiet contemplation. They stopped by the fence line he had been mending what felt like a lifetime ago. "The fence is crooked," she said, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. "I know," he replied, his own smile reaching his eyes. "We can fix it. Tomorrow." It was a simple exchange, but it held the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. The journey ahead would be long. They would have to learn a new language with each other, one built on trust instead of control, on affection instead of fear. But as they stood there, two lonely souls on a vast expanse of land, they were no longer a mistress and her servant. They were just a man and a woman, finally free to build a new foundation, not for the ranch, but for each other, under a sky big enough to hold all of their dreams. True freedom is not found by simply escaping our physical cages, but by finding the courage to redefine our own worth and break the internal chains of fear. This story teaches us that true partnership is built on mutual respect, not ownership, and that even the most controlling heart, when faced with its own loneliness, can learn the language of empathy and love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.